Okay, so once again, I'm out in my garage, and this is the coldest day so far of the year. I'm surprised we haven't gotten, weather like this before. But anyways, let's talk about something interesting. So, just like Kangaskhan being, a Cubone, eventually Cubone. But here's what, the baby at least. But here's what's really interesting though, just like a lot of the other prototype data that's been found in, Gen 1 to Gen 2, and, we're not really going to talk about Gen 2 at this case, but, you kind of get the idea though, timeline-wise. There's always been this idea that Kangaskhan, Marowak, Cubone, the baby Kangaskhan as well, I'll just call it Orphan in this case. And then there's a Pokemon called Guardia, which is what Marowak technically evolved into. I've always wondered 100%, we know for a fact that, Kangaskhan was sort of related to Marowak and Cubone, but like we really never had any, we never really knew like what direction to take it in, there's been like these timelines people have came out with where we would understand like Pokemon like Kangaskhan and Guardia and all them to be like, like their own separate evolution line. But thanks to like those scrapped evolutions and all that, we were able to finally figure out, hey, you know what? Maybe we can finally figure this whole thing out. Now, personally, this is what I believe. As of right now, when the original 190 Pokemon came out, well, technically it would have been 191 because Omega took Mew's place. Mew was in slot 21, but technically speaking, in the prototype I was playing, they saved it as 191. So I wouldn't be surprised that, they did it just so people would know. So you had a Techno robot that would defend the Silph, and then that kind of like a Mecha Godzilla basically, because it's basically where they got the inspiration from. And Ultraman. So if you don't know, Ultraman 7, the superhero, the one that the Power Rangers were based on and all that, was actually what inspired Pokemon. If you didn't know that, like that's where they got a lot of their ideas from. A lot of old Japanese monster movies and shows and all that. It's just really cool, like how they used to build that stuff. But we'll get into that video another time though. But anyways, so it made sense they had a lot of scrapped ideas from that series. Okay, so you kind of get the idea. But anyways, here's where it gets interesting though. So I was always thinking that number 135, as far as the index numbers go, not in the 151 Dexter, but one where like Rhydon was like the very first Pokemon. 135 is one of the missing those that we still don't know, but there's a blur image of it on the internet. But the other ones we have no idea because there's no evidence of it. But I was looking at it very carefully, and I swear every time I look at it, we found Guardia, and then there's, a lot of the Pokemon that were scrapped from Gen 2 were probably redesigned for Gen 2. A lot of baby Pokemon that were probably from Gen 1 that should have been in there. I wouldn't be surprised at some point that baby Kangaskhan, and when I say baby Kangaskhan, I don't mean like, Cubone. I think those are two different Pokemon. I would not be surprised in the slightest if baby Kangaskhan was supposed to be an actual Pokemon at one point. So it would make sense. You would have baby Kangaskhan, then it evolved into Kangaskhan, or maybe not. Maybe they took the approach where, and this is where it gets confusing because you start to figure out like a lot of these ideas were scrapped, but like maybe the idea is still there. Think of it like those Sesame Street patterns they used to teach us when we were kids. Like they would show you like the pattern, and then all of a sudden like you had to figure out the rest of it. That's just like the first thing that comes to my mind. When I think of like child logic. But put it this way, so like we know okay, so like the idea would be that you would have like Kangaskhan's its own Pokemon, but it's related to Cubone, Marowak, and Guardia. So like, let's say, okay, Cubone evolves into Marowak, Marowak evolves into Guardia, and then, again, Kangaskhan could possibly evolve from a Marowak, like a female Marowak, because if I remember correctly, Kangaskhan is always female. I don't think there is such thing as a male Kangaskhan. There's the idea that, okay, so if the baby Kangaskhan was still a the orphan in this case, maybe it was just adopted, and then that baby Kangaskhan would evolve in a Cubone. And then depending on the sex of it, the baby at least, and then as it ages and grows up, that Pokemon would eventually become, you know, because if it's a male, I could see it evolving into Guardia, and then, you know, and then if the female then evolved into Kangaskhan. But it's kind of interesting to think, though, that, you know, you still have, like Marowak still has, like, it's interesting to think, like, how this works. You know, Kangaskhan was, in fact, supposed to be, like, a Cubone that wears its mother's skull. But, you know, but then you start thinking about, like, was it really Marowak that... See, this is where it gets confusing, because, like, you know, like take, like, Lavender Town, for example. Everybody remembers the Pokemon Tower and all that, and fun fact, you know, even in the prototype, you could actually go there and catch Vulpixes, and later on you could find, like a Ninetales in some areas of, not the actual Poke Tower, but, like, a later on, like, the Labyrinth that brings back the Lavender Town. It's part of the Elite Four. Like, there's another Labyrinth, not Victory Road, that you go through before you get to the Elite Four itself, the members of the Elite Four. So it's very interesting how that works. So they had like you could catch Ninetales, you could catch Vulpix there, and you know, and if anything, you could catch Mekon there, which is the pre-evolved form of Vulpix. Imagine that. But I don't think even in the prototype you could. So maybe it was like, you know, Mekon was supposed to be like you know, Trifox in this case was the baby Vulpix. So anyways, yeah, it's interesting how they made these games over the years. But anyways, allow me to explain something else. So we'll look at the Pokemon that we know so far, and we'll try the best we can to explain this based on what we know. So Vulpix and Cubone would evolve from, you know, another baby Pokemon, also known as, again, if you look at the evolutionary chart, it would probably evolve from a baby Pokemon. Yeah, so Cubone, by definition, is not like a pure baby. It's more of like a, you know, it's one of those examples of a Pokemon that it has its own stats, it has its own abilities and the whatnot, and it's basically its own, it's a child, basically. It's a little grown up, but it's not an infant at that point. It's still young and innocent, you know. Kind of like, you know, when a human's born, you know, you have the baby, and then, like, you know, and then it goes into the child stage. It's no longer an infant, but it's still very young and naive too, very mischief indeed, depending on how they behave. But you get the idea. So, anyways, I feel like that's what they kind of would have done, you know, because Kangaskhan, by definition, and this is where it gets confusing, but at the same time, this is like the best information we can go off of. Kangaskhan itself is supposed to be based on the idea of Kangaskhan, the actual leader, and I forget exactly where it was at that he was the leader, but he was basically like one of the greatest war heroes. He not only that, but he united a lot of areas. He adopted a lot of children that he called them. I think he was like an Indian sort of, like in that sense. So basically, they took the concept and the story of that, and they basically centered it around the idea that, you know, you have these Pokemon that are adopted by this mother, you know, because Kangaskhan's always carrying a baby. So where they get the baby, it's probably just an abandoned, you know, Kangaskhan at some point, or maybe it you know, they breeded with Marowaks, and then they male Marowaks, or Guardias in this case, let's just say. But then again, you know, where does Guardia get the Cubone at? And, you know, but then that's probably it, though. Maybe they had so many baby Pokemon at the same time, though, but they scrapped Guardia, so they had to change the story a little bit. And so now we're up to the idea that, you know, not only is Kangaskhan a baby Cubone, but it's at the same time, though, that the baby Cubone is actually Guardia, actually, it's like a tribe thing, you know, if we had the full evolution at some point, you know, it could have been like, you know, it'd be like Guardia was supposed to be like one of the tribe leaders because it's strong, and at the same time, though, they watched over the whole family, you know, the mother would adopt the Cubones, and they'd help other out, or they just, you know, take care of the other Cubones, or the baby Kangaskhan's. Because at this point, I'm convinced that, you know, Cubone is baby Kangaskhan. But baby Kangaskhan is its own evolution before it evolves into a Cubone, but only after its mother dies or something like that. But they probably still would have kept like the idea that Cubone evolves from a level and there's more than one Cubone. You know, there's Cubones that are baby Kangaskhan's that lost their mother, but not all of them necessarily wear skulls on their head, you know, going based on the anime logic. Because like imagine, you know, maybe not all those Cubones, because again, it gets really confusing because you really think about it. There are going to be contradictions in the way you look at it like this, but this would make sense though. You know, you're going to have, you know, they're probably breeding more than they do. You're going to have all these little young infants, all these babies coming from the same mother. And not every single one of them can wear the mother's skull, for example. So, you know, as far as the games go, because it's just sprites and animations, every Cubone has a mother's skull. So you can kind of see where it kind of wouldn't make sense. But maybe that's what they were getting at, though, with the evolution. You know, because we're supposed to see it as like, you know, for every Kangaskhan, there's one Cubone, or one Cubone, there's one Kangaskhan. But at the same time, though, there's always the idea that every time you find a Cubone, its mother's gone. So maybe there was more than one Kangaskhan that we just don't see. Because again, and it's funny because if you think about it, even though Cubone is a completely different Pokemon than Kangaskhan, Kangaskhan is a lot harder to catch and a lot harder to find than that of like somebody like a Cubone, for example. Even though both are kind of rare, but Kangaskhan was always harder to catch because it's got a bigger catch rate. And so again, you know, if these two evolutionary change are in fact true, like there was a Guardia evolution and then there was a baby Kangaskhan at one point, I wouldn't be surprised in the slightest that there was probably a lot more information there that maybe Game Freak could update us on. A lot of scrap Pokemon, or maybe they just decided, you know, maybe Cubone was already young enough and it kind of would have made a little bit more sense to think, well, okay, Kangaskhan is a foreign parent, a foster parent, and they just kept it simple where like you had like Kangaskhan was a lonely Pokemon, its mother dies, it wears its skull, and then eventually that skull, you know, because it never takes it off, it evolves in a Marowak, and the skull basically becomes its head, you know? So it's like got two skulls now. You got the exoskeleton of its mother's skull, and it's got its skull too fused in its own. So it's like a really thick skull, you know, so Kangaskhan and, you know, Marowak and all that, they would breed one another, and, you know, or there's the concept also too that maybe at one point, you know, maybe Marowaks did evolve into Kangaskhan's, but again, I still think that Kangaskhan would have been one of the very first Pokemon too, because here's what's really interesting. If you look at the index numbers, you have Rhydon as the very first Pokemon. Kangaskhan was the second Pokemon drawn, and not too shortly after, I don't know when, but Cubone was added too. So I wouldn't be surprised in the slightest that maybe they started, like maybe when they were going down the list of Pokemon before they started voting on the ones they wanted to, because this is a whole nother story and you'd have to look into it. I wouldn't be surprised that Cubone, you know, you had Guardia, Cubone, because Guardia came first, technically, in the index numbers, and then there was later, then they probably thought 135 was good. They probably wrote down, well, there was a baby Kangaskhan, but then they probably thought, well, maybe we don't need this baby Pokemon because Cubone looks like that baby Pokemon, and then it evolved into a Marowak, and you can basically see. So, but there's even still debates to this day people have where, you know, is Kangaskhan really supposed to be Cubone's mother, or was it Marowak in some regards? Because again, you know, look at it, think of it like this. Even in some cases, you know, Marowak kind of does look like the skull that Cubone wears. But it's also really interesting because maybe Kangaskhan was supposed to be Cubone. So you kind of got this confusion. You know, Cubone, so basically it's like Cubone has like two different families. Kangaskhan is its adopted foster parent, and then you have its real mother or father could have been a Marowak. You know, like, again, but would I be surprised at all that it still runs in the family? We just don't know which way to look at it. But the way I'm looking at it, I mean, I would still argue at the end of the day that rather than looking at Kangaskhan and Cubone's family, looking at like they're two different lines of evolutions, I would say they're all together as one somehow. In some way, shape, or form, they're still related because it makes a lot more sense when you think about it, when you really dig into it. So again, if you like these kind of videos, again, subscribe, comment. If I find something else, I will definitely update you on it. But until then, again, what do you guys think? But to basically put it in a short reference, if I had to say that the Cubone timeline had anything to do with it, I would say that Kangaskhan's its own Pokemon. Then the baby, well, basically, let's rephrase that. You have, the baby Kangaskhan would evolve into Cubone. Cubone would evolve into Marowak, and it would be like a split evolution if there were genders at this point. A male Marowak would evolve into a Guardia, and then a female Marowak could eventually evolve into a Kangaskhan. Or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there could be female Guardias, and maybe Kangaskhan is, while it is related to Cubone and all that, because again, maybe instead of it evolving into a Kangaskhan, it would have just basically have just been its own Pokemon. But I think they would have evolved it, because then that way it would have been full circle. It wouldn't have just been like, maybe there were Kangaskhan's coming from other families of Marowaks that were adopting, and then they just had sex with, and they just bred Pokemon from, because again, Kangaskhan is a mother. But it's got to come from somewhere too, so that it just kind of makes sense when you think about it, whether from one family or another family of Marowaks, but I wouldn't be surprised in the slightest that it's just a circle of circles, of logic. You try to figure out where Cubone evolves into what, and where do they draw the line at. But I think maybe realistically, I wouldn't be surprised if Marowak did evolve into Kangaskhan at one point. How that would have worked, it would have been a little bit different, but the skull would have definitely been different. It probably would have, like, the skin would have grown over it, but then again, it's Pokemon we're talking about, so anything's possible when they're shifting through evolutionary stages and shaping their physical appearance a lot differently.